Thank you, Susanna, for your introduction. It's warm there. I'm still going to go front. Hi, everyone. Just thank you so much. It's so nice being here. It's fun being the former something, because broadly speaking, it means I get to be unemployed and look after my son in Amsterdam. Which also means I was actually invited to speak at this conference when I was still employed. I'm very grateful that I was allowed to maintain this invitation in my unemployed state and get to share experiences I had at the Met and previously as a consultant. I've been working for about 17 years now in museums. I feel very grateful to be the first person speaking, because I don't know about you guys, I always get very nervous in like social situations. And so now that I'm a first person speaking, hopefully there'll be loads of things I forget to say, which will give you reasons to ask me questions over the next 2 days. And I welcome that, because like those small conversations are what I love being with groups of colleagues for. So consider this to be like ideas for conversations, and feel free to like, what I want then is it removes responsibility of me to come and talk to you. You can all come and talk to me, and I can be nervous in a corner. And finally, I just have to say thank you. It's my first time speaking at a ShareCare conference. And you know, Mareda, like it's awesome. Like, you bring people like this together, it's really cool to be here. And congratulations for you for getting these kind of conferences going. So look, there we go. My name is LOIC. I was at the Met for 5.5 years. I was the Chief Digital Officer at the Met. So I had a job title with the word digital in it. And it's like my pet thing now is to get the word digital removed from any person's job title, okay? How many people have the word digital in their job title in this room? It's about, okay, like a quarter, okay. Let's consider that your project in the next year to get that word removed from your job title. I tried it at the Met by trying to be the last chief digital officer. So my theory was that I would just leave and no one would take my job title after I left. That would be what success looked like. I failed, just to say. I have recommended the museum gets a new chief digital officer. And I'll talk about that, why that is. I'll kind of come as I talk. But ultimately, this is a lot about change. I'm going to focus on the open data work we did at the Met in particular, because that's kind of why we're here. And what I thought I would do is find kind of five lessons, 5 things that we did with the Met after going open data. So I really answer this question of now what. So I'm going to talk a little bit less about why we did it, but just think about what's happening next and try and frame this in a way that any institution can do it. I think it's very privileging working at the Met, ultimately. I mean, it's an enormous place. 2,500 people work there. Our operating budget is 300 million. I'll just let that settle in. You know, we have 7 and a bit million people coming to our building each year. In the department that had the magic word digital, we were 70 people. Okay, so I was managing a team of 70 people, which is basically it's an army. I mean, like, you know, my staff meetings, this is what it looked like. And we had a big budget. You know, we had a budget that was $10 million. So, you know, 10 of that 30 million went towards digital. So it allows us to do things in particular ways. I always made the point to my team is just because you have more money doesn't mean you make better decisions. A good decision is a good decision. I mean, money can't pay for those things. And so hopefully the things, what it does allow you to do though is like probably make more mistakes and learn. Because you get to have greater spikes, like greater areas of specialization. And hopefully the things I've pulled out here are things that you'll look at and go, okay, so that's the lesson they learned. Let me think about what that means to us. I was going to like do the presentation focusing on the 5 principles of the department. And these are 5 things that have nothing to do with open data, but actually, in my opinion, have everything to do with anything we're doing in the digital space. Like doing the fundamentals brilliant, just focusing on the core aspects of what we're working on. It's like the number 1 line I'd tell my team. And the reason I'm just going to show those quickly is because there is some larger message in this that like going open data is not the goal. It's just not the goal. And so I worked really hard at the Met to make open access just one thing of many things that we did. It was a tactic. But I didn't want it to be the main oxygen in the room. And it really helped us by taking that kind of approach. It was one thing that we did. And I, hence, just like saying, yeah, just do open data the same way we do everything else in the department. Let's not make this something special. It's just part of what we do. So those are just 5 rules we had, and I'm happy to dive deeper into those. I have chosen for this to focus more on lessons about open data in particular, just to be really clear what we did at the Met. So everyone knows, so in February, we did make all of our images available CC0. What it meant, it was the images themselves, it was the data next to them. So all the images became available for people to download high res, and all the data associated with it, the metadata at the bottom. When I say all is like a lot of, much, some, a proportion of the data about the artwork was also made available. So that's our open data kind of set. I think it's really important that, now that I'm not at the Met, I can also reference, lots of the other work that's been shared. I mean, the Rijksmuseum was a big inspiration for us. When we did it, I think the work happening at SMK is fantastic. MoMA, when they made the open data API, the way they wrote about it, I found was really inspiring and informed lots of our work. And just another project that I think is a reference one for me is what the Cleveland Museum just did. I think the way they've done their CC0 policy is fantastic and really comprehensive. And I think every project kind of learned something from the one previously. There isn't necessarily a right way of doing it, but when I talk about what we did at the Met, I also reference what other institutions have done, because it made us get where we've got to. So these are the 5 principles I'm going to talk about over the next kind of 20 minutes. And yeah, so I'll just jump straight in. I'll start with this idea of being purposeful. There is, I once gave a presentation about 6 months ago, a year ago, to the WikiGLAM community, and the question I asked was open access, why? Why do it? And there's got to be that larger purpose behind it. At the Met, we spent a long time thinking about the purpose of going open access, to be able to really clearly articulate that open access in its own right was not the end goal. And to give you a sense of how we did that, here's the building. That's our mission statement. I'm going to read this thing because I love it. The Metropolitan Museum of Art collects, studies, conserves, and presents significant works of art across all times and cultures in order to connect people to creativity, knowledge, and ideas. Now, first of all, I find that a really awesome statement. I felt very lucky to work for an institution where this was the end goal. When we were just looking at what it meant to be a museum, how do you fulfill this mission in the best possible way? Particularly this second part about connecting people to creativity, knowledge, and ideas. How do you do that in the most impactful, resource-efficient way you possibly can? And that's a fundamental question as a department, as a museum, we would keep going back to. And 2 things I always say about this mission statement when we're brainstorming it is, one is that it doesn't mention a building. There is no building in there. The building was a tactic that was developed in the 19th century for fulfilling this mission. And if anyone finds, there's a really fascinating, if you look at the history of the Smithsonian Institute and how they started, it was a genuine question whether James Smithson was going to build a series of museums in DC or build an educational program. Because there are other ways of fulfilling this mission. I make the point also there's no mention of a website. It really is just this aspirational statement. So the question then becomes what's the best way of doing it given the tools we have today, and also given the assets we have of the history of the museum as we've known it. Because we have a significant advantage that we're building on these institutions that have these collections, that have these galleries. How do we think about what the future looks like? Fulfilling that mission, most likely in a virtual world, but making sure we're bringing all the assets, the qualities, what's exceptional about these physical buildings and where we've been in the last 150 years. How do we bring that with us? And the concept, the purpose we really came down to at the Met, the big picture idea was this one. I would talk a lot about the idea in the Met's collection. What's unique about it, it's an encyclopedic collection. The thing is amazing. There is an artwork in that collection that could inspire every individual in the world. I fundamentally believe that. Every single person in the world, there's something that would inspire them. So let's just choose our audience is basically anyone who has an internet connection. That's it. Now I tell my team, hey guys, I've done my bit, that's yours. Let's go. The audience is 3.9 billion internet-connected people around the world. And it was a real moment that became our purpose, to think how we're going to connect people like that. And what I liked about this as well is, what was nice about it, our website had about 31 million people coming to it each year. It's a nice number, 31 million people. It's still 1/100th of that. And if you're going to get to 3.9 billion, you're not going to grow by a factor of 100 by working harder. It's just, you're going to do it by thinking differently. You're just going to have to start thinking differently. And that prompt really helped us a great deal, and we kind of identified if we are going to hit this, what are those things we need to think about? And so we started thinking about our audience. We really thought, we're going to reach people who don't speak the language the museum has predominantly been built around. We're going to reach people who actually don't know the museum exists, which makes me sad. People don't know the Met exists. Thank you all for knowing it exists. But let's be honest, there are people who, more people in the world don't know our museum exists than do know it exists. And that's the Met saying that. And we can prove it, so we can have that insecurity. We want to reach people who don't think museums are for them. There are a lot of people who come to New York and don't go to the Met. There are people who don't know the role museums can have for them. So we want to get past the idea of the word museum being a barrier. Even people don't like art. God bless, but they love Instagram. We wouldn't say they love art. So we were really thinking, how can we reach people beyond these, get past these barriers? The language one was a different exercise. I'm going to focus mostly on those three. And the change in thinking we really went through is this one, to really think the idea wasn't to get people to our website. If we removed the idea that success was getting people to our website, it was to get people to the collection, because that's where you were connecting them to knowledge, creativity, and ideas. That moment was our little aha moment. And we decided to focus on 3 tactics for doing that, and these are the 3 tactics. Licensing was just one of them. I only call it appropriate licensing of content. I don't call it open. You can decide. When I said at the start, all our data was open, our artwork data, only some of it is ultimately. A lot of the Met's data still is not open for good reason, and I'm happy to go into that granularity. How we manage the data and partnerships. Those are our 3 tactics to achieve this larger mission and this purpose of reaching 3.9 billion people. And we talked about it a lot. We had a dashboard to it. I do love data. I'm not going to talk a lot about data, but let me just overwhelm you for 2 seconds. Just to give you a sense, this is the second page of a 2-page document I would send out every month, reporting on the performance of the department. The top KPIs, the key performance indicators that we would use are these 3. So we'd measure unique users to the website, collection page views, amount of art consumed, and access on third-party platforms. We just used the Wikipedia stat for third-party platforms because we didn't have as significant penetration on any other platform. So we could have added Google Arts and Culture on there, but it was a blip on the radar compared. So it was KPI-based, and that's what we were using to see how successful we were at hitting our purpose. The second thing, learn and iterate. There is working in any kind of change space in museums, and digital being one of them. The reality is there is no blueprint. It's not as if anyone can stand up here and say, hey, if you do this, 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 and this, you've got this, you're done. Everyone's basically making it up. It's just a reality. Frankly, the big companies, Google, Apple, they are making it up as well. And we just need to remember that a great deal, because everyone is just learning together. And I think if you take that approach and think there is not one perfect way of doing it, you're going to be in a lot stronger position as an institution just to have that brain space. There is no one way of doing this. You can learn from, I find it good fun when people look at the Met and say, oh, we'll do what the Met did. And just to show you a Met path of learning, which no one talks about now, but I thought I'd just remind us, does anyone know what this is? OASC, people remember this? So in September 2014, the Met went open access. Well, that's what we said. And we basically had created this license and reported on it in May 2014. The Met releases free access to 400,000 digital images. This was our press release. It got reported on widely. And the license we used was one called Open Access for Scholarly Content. It's kind of like CCNC as a license, but not really, because we made our own license. And we did this, and we were proud as an institution to have taken a step in the open access direction. It never really hit traction, because in fact, lots of people started criticizing us for this license. They said, well, why have you, first of all, invented your own license? It's not machine readable. What's that about? People were criticizing us that we passed lots of the liability onto the next user by saying it's only scholarly content. Like, how do you define scholarly content? Is my toddler a scholar? But no, we want your toddler to use the collection, we'll call them. It was a very unclear license. And we learned from this. So when 2.5 years later, we went CC0 with the collection, we had this building block on which to grow on. And frankly, when you look at most institutions who have taken this path, they have learned as they went along. I mean, even the RIKES, it wasn't the highest res images that went out right at the start. It's really important to note. They got there. But like, I just think these kinds of, this kind of awareness, don't just look at these institutions, they look where they are now, see the path they took, and realize that all of us just have to walk our own path and learn as we go along. I had to say, make decisions. You know, one of my pet frustrations, I'll find a good word for it, is because we're all making it up as we go along, there is no perfect decision. Let's be really clear about this. And nothing frustrates me more than not making decisions. We do need to make progress. And so I really encourage it, like, learn and iterate as make decisions. Because if you're making decisions and looking at how your decisions are impacting, you can course correct and make improvements as you go along. But don't use this as an excuse to say, okay, let's just talk about it for 2 years. Yeah, God, I'll kill myself. A third thing, amplifying and partnering. It was right at the origin when we looked at what programs doing open data have done. I mean, there's nothing better than someone else saying something good about your institution rather than you saying it yourself. It's just not. I mean, right from the start, when we launched Open Access CC0 in 2017, this was a slide I showed at the press launch of the different partners we set up with. Jane Alexander at Cleveland managed to get 10 partners for launch, which I thought was completely amazing. I don't know how she achieved it. But we did realize very quickly that actually to really start having impact, to get off our own website, to get, if the purpose was to get access to people where they are, not necessarily on metmuseum.org, we needed to work with other websites or other platforms, and we need to do that in a very concerted way and make it part of our strategy. And so partnerships was a big piece. I really encourage anyone, no matter the size of the organization you are, find people who are interested in your data and encourage them to start using it, hold their hand in using it, build that relationship. At the Met, the one that became super important to us was Wikipedia, and these graphics I've published online, but I still refer back to them because these look at our page views of the collection online, so artwork on our website. There you can see 2016, 2017, incremental growth. We're improving how we work. And then at the same time, if you just look at our traffic on Wikipedia over that same period, you have a 5-fold increase. I know right now we're reaching about 20 million people a month on Wikipedia with our content. We went from like 2 or 3 million people a month to 20. That's a significant change, significant growth. And that's all because of a partnership, because of another community embracing this content. And there's an article I wrote about this online, so I won't get too much further into this, but this concept, I think after a year, we suddenly realized how important that partnership was to us. We're like, okay, we got that one, let's solidify it and then figure out which other partners we can get, because it amplifies the impact that we're trying to achieve. Just a few more to give you an example of some of the traffic differences. It's a very different experience of looking at the Henry VIII. This armor, by the way, is completely awesome. He clearly never wore this. It's so bulky, but he looks really glamorous, which is probably not the image of Henry VIII we all have. But you compare the traffic, like the art experience on this page is very different to the Henry VIII page on Wikipedia. It's really different. This is far down the page, to be really clear. This is not at the top. But the fact that we're participating in those conversations for us is super important. The fact that on the, one of the ones we often quote is on the Iran page and Nigeria page on Wikipedia, you now find artworks from the Met collection. That's where we want to be. There are more people in the world who are interested in Iran as a country than a specific Iranian artwork, which is why they might come to metmuseum.org. The languages side, this is again, that's an artwork in our collection, the death of Socrates, and on Wikipedia, that's been translated into 29 languages. So huge increase into the access, and of course, we weren't really involved. We weren't involved in this page. It's nicely linked back to us, although we don't actually track as a KPI traffic from Wikipedia to the metmuseum.org. That isn't a goal, but we are. The fact that these pages exist, we think is fantastic. It increases access to the collection. I put this up here. This is about 2 years in. Catherine and I wrote an article just trying to capture what we thought what could be that relationship between cultural institutions and Wikipedia. I still see there's more space, there's more work to be done in this space, but it gives a point towards where partnerships could be, and I say the Wikipedia one was a big one for us. And we still do various editathons at the museum. We actually have someone now dedicated to that area of really building regular events of Wikimedia community, because we just see it as really important to our future. It's as simple as that. Wikipedia is one of the, I think, the 6th biggest website in terms of visits now, and we just see it as an important point for us. Communicate and enable. What I wanted to capture here is my favorite sentence, which is doing the fundamentals brilliantly. It's so easy when you're working in a space when so much is possible to get really sucked in by the sexy stuff. You know, people get out of bed with a spring in their step when they're going to build an augmented reality thing or build an app. You know, you don't get out of bed with the same spring in your step when your aim is to decrease page load time or to improve SEO. It's just not the same spirit, but like those things have far more impact. And so I used to tell my team a lot, like, what are the fundamental pieces we have to be doing? We're not a tech organization. We may have 70 people, we may be a large team, but we're not a tech organization. None of us work for tech organizations. Like, we need to be using the skill sets, doing the pieces we are responsible for fundamentally really well. So what that meant for us, and 2 pieces that I think about a lot when I look at other institutions' open data exercises. One around communication, because frankly, open data and open access doesn't mean that much to most people. There's been very little traction. We saw at the Met with the word open access, or open as a thing. We're like, I thought the museum was open. Yeah, the doors are open, but what is it? It's just not. These words don't resonate. I mean, that's our experience. So we spent a lot of exercise, a fair amount of exercise, on actually figuring out how to communicate about it. And I actually went through my archive to find the old slides. Like we actually did a whole kind of mini branding exercise. Like, how are we going to communicate about this thing in a way that means something to people, that they understand, normal human beings, not like the people who are deep in it. We looked at other logos which are out there, and it's not a problem that is a museum problem. It's kind of anyone working in kind of research scholarship space. You know, these are our different boards, things we were considering, and we end up going for something like that, which is like we did stick with open access. We found when we tested it, it was the one thing that actually piqued people's interest more than open data. That's where we ended up. If people don't use usertesting.com, forget everything else I'm saying, usertesting.com is a really great website to load anything up to, like literally anything, and get like however many people you want. Like, you can get 100 people to give feedback on your idea, whether it's a website design, whether it's copy, whether it's an image. And that's what we did, and we tested this, and this came out best. So getting that identity right was an exercise. I encourage you to think, how are you going to communicate about this in a way that is meaningful with your audience? The second part is doing that like managing the data, building an API to your collection, enabling people to get hold of the data in formats that are meaningful to them. We had an API, we had a CSV, and we did a lot of, as soon as you make a CSV or an API public, you've then got to maintain this thing. If these things don't live on their own, it's another public point that you are responsible for maintaining. And it's really fundamental to the entire program. So don't underestimate how much work that will take to keep your CSV up to date or your API. These are new public products. This was an article I wrote actually when we did the API. We actually chose to launch it with a partnership with Google Arts and Culture. The reason we did this, and I want to talk about it, is there are various mixed views around what Google Arts and Culture is doing in our space. And one thing that really impressed me, this partnership, is we knew we were, like, Google Arts and Culture invested in the sector, and we wanted to test our API. So we actually told Google Arts and Culture, hey guys, you guys need to learn how to connect to APIs for Google Arts and Culture, and we have one. And so it gave us an opportunity to hold hands with a large organization in absorbing the Met's API and testing it out, which is what we did. We also organized with them that by doing this, we would start appearing more in the Google Knowledge Graph, which is the search results on the right-hand side. I mean, about 65 to 70%, or 65 to 67% of the Met's traffic to the collection starts at Google. It's an incredibly important source. I wouldn't be surprised if many of us are in that same world. And especially as, we see the space for growth. We saw the space for growth at the Met as not as branded searches, so someone saying Picasso the Met. We want to be in the conversation about Picasso, not when someone says we want the Met's answer. So those kind of, getting into Google Knowledge Graph, having good SEO is so important. It also, this API launch did lead to one of my favorite projects, which is our partnership with Parsons. A whole series of students developed different interactors in the collection related to the data. My favorite of which is this one, which is still live. Ryan Best created this. And this is actually a map of the travel, the itinerary of this Van Gogh painting over its history. So we are taking the data of when the painting changed ownership, when it was purchased, and then when it went on temporary exhibitions to do the world tour of the Van Gogh's wheat fields, which I thought was fun, and no one had ever done this before, so that intrigued me. And I dare say, I think the kinds of projects that happen, which you're not even aware of, those are like the magic. This is the last one I'll make, enriching the data set. I'm a big believer on this idea. I subscribe to the idea that a number of people here have the museum as platform. If there's one thing that we as organizations have as a unique asset, which no one can compete with us on, it is the data. It's the collection itself. I mean, honestly, I would often talk about, my department at the Met had three major responsibilities. We were responsible for the data. We would produce content, publish content, videos, audio. And then the third team would build the platforms, so build the website, build the apps. And in those three different disciplines, if you look at the first one, like managing the data, like no one can do that for us. Let's be really clear. Like if we mess that up, it's done. I mean, like, no one can come in and save us on that point. We are responsible for managing that data. We have a competitive advantage. We have access to it in a way no one else does. It's the core responsibility, that data. Producing good, which you're not even aware of. Those are like the magic. This is the last one I'll make, enriching the data set. I'm a big believer on this idea. I subscribe to the idea that a number of people here have the museum as platform. If there's one thing that we as organizations have as a unique asset, which no one can compete with us on, it is the data. It's the collection itself. I mean, honestly, I would often talk about, my department at the Met had three major responsibilities. We were responsible for the data. We would produce content, publish content, videos, audio. And then the third team would build the platforms, so build the website, build the apps. And in those three different disciplines, if you look at the first one, like managing the data, like no one can do that for us. Let's be really clear. Like if we mess that up, it's done. I mean, like, no one can come in and save us on that point. We are responsible for managing that data. We have a competitive advantage. We have access to it in a way no one else does. It's the core responsibility, that data. Producing good content, we had a competitive advantage at the Met. We had access to the curators. We learned about the collection, so we know it more intimately. So we have a competitive advantage creating great interpretive content about the collection. But there are other people doing it as well. And they make really fantastic content. And when they do that, they're actually helping us fulfill our mission. They're helping connect people to knowledge, creativity, and ideas. So actually, when it comes to content, we want to help people to do it, but then use our competitive advantage when we can. In the third space, like building websites, museums have no competitive advantage. Let's be really clear. Like, we don't. Getting talent to work in that space is super expensive. It's super challenging to hold on to people. Even the people who are companies trying to just build websites and apps struggle a huge deal. I mean, if anyone observed when Snapchat did their remodeling, their new user experience, the pain it went through, and that's Snapchat, like a company who is paying a fortune to get the best developers, the best UX designers, the best everything, and they're still struggling to build platforms that people are using. If you remember that analogy, I actually told the museum we should be thinking about this. Like, we should invest the most in our data and kind of linearly up. Like, we should build the smallest amount of website we can possibly get away with. Genuinely. I mean, like, if you look at my history of the museum, I was like cutting our website down everywhere I possibly could. So we have the smallest amount of website that we could possibly manage that fulfilled our business needs, but that we could maintain at a high quality that the Met expected. That was our goal. And we did, I mean, we chopped a huge amount off. We took down our app because we decided it wasn't worth investing in anymore. The ROI, the return on investment, wasn't significantly high enough. The data became this core piece, and I really encourage just people to remember, no one can step in on the data side for us. So my fifth message, I guess I would take away, is around the data, is around enriching it. And one example I want to give at the Met was that we were looking at how people were using the open access data set. And one of the challenges, people weren't sure how to manipulate it and find new meaning out of it because there weren't any subject keywords. So people didn't know what was in the artwork. Okay, so you didn't know if there was a cat or a monkey or Jesus or Buddha. So we actually went through an exercise of getting the whole thing tagged. It was intense. This is just to report back on it. I mean, so to be really clear, we worked with a subcontractor based in India to literally tag every single artwork that was open access in the Met's collection. I can now tell you authoritatively there are 55,000 men and 34,000 women, 400 monkeys. We made this data set open access as well, so people now could start manipulating and using the data set in more interesting ways. It really moved the whole program a step up because it allowed new things to happen with the collection, to know what was actually in the artwork, that a computer could read that data. You know, we could start finding artworks with dancing from across times, across periods. We could find artworks about reading across times, across periods, from a samurai sword handle to photographs. And this project underpins a lot of what the Met is doing right now in this space, when they start thinking, how can we keep scaling our impact? So we have a really nice partnership with Wikipedia. We built our partnership with Google in a sustainable way of the API feed. As AI technologies start coming into the world and become a bigger part of our everyday, we start thinking how this data set could inform AI tech. We actually did a partnership through Cornell campus in Cornell University. They have a campus in New York. VC is fine grain visual, what's the C? Ooh, recognition. I thought it was recognition. Visual categorization, fine grain visual categorization. We discovered that there's this whole field of research where people are like using algorithms trying to identify things, so get the computer to identify what butterfly it is from 10,000 butterflies. And we actually came up with this competition, which came out in June, and I encourage you to look it up because it went relatively under the radar, was part of this conference, and where we literally ran a competition where we said, hey, here are the keywords to the Met's collection. Your aim is now to write an algorithm that uses visual recognition to recognize the content of all the other artworks in the collection. And we were judging them based on their accuracy. So can you write a computer algorithm to recognize every monkey in the collection? It was a fun project, and it's given the museum its first kind of understanding of how visual recognition could start helping us. A more high-profile project, which is the one I'll kind of close up on, was a partnership we did with MIT and Microsoft. And this was our launch event just before I left the museum. I'm wearing exactly the same clothes. That's amazing. I planned this. I have one outfit for these events. I'm not self-conscious. This partnership really was, I believe the most interesting things that happen with a collection are the ones a museum probably isn't even that involved in. Not even probably, that we are not involved in. You discover them by coming to events like this and meeting people who are doing fascinating things with a collection. ANDREA, wherever he is, already showed me one today. It's that kind of stuff that I find inspiring and scales, like getting people to use your collection in different ways. And so with Microsoft and MIT, we wanted to demonstrate that possibility. Microsoft, I think, their work in the AI space is really interesting right now, really turning AI into a service. MIT, because of the research they do in that space. And so we made this project using AI to scale the impact of a collection. And this project, for me, nicely kind of encapsulated what we were trying to do in open access, because it wasn't really about open access. And I've got a little video that I'm going to play just as the last piece. It's like a 2-minute video, and just kind of captures what this project was.
For us, it's important to understand the Met is not just a place that you visit. It's really a great service to an audience all around the world.
We believe we have one object that can inspire every single person in the planet. How can we reduce the distance between each of those people and the object that will inspire them? In February 2017, the museum made the decision to release all the images and data of our public domain artwork free of any copyright restriction.
We are photographing all of our 2 million objects that the Met houses. Our task is really to share our collection, to disseminate our knowledge to as many people as possible.
Now we want to ask a question. Using AI technologies, what can people build on that? We've brought together teams from the Met, Microsoft, MIT, and we have a hackathon happening.
We can create experiences around art that really have never been seen before because the technology we have today has never been available before.
Artificial intelligence finds patterns that the human eye doesn't capture, and we start actually learning about ourselves better than we probably knew already.
One way that we preserve culture is to give people tools to create new things with it and to spread those creations across the globe.
Because these two worlds of tech and art are bleeding closer together, that creates a fertile ground for new projects and perspectives on technology that we can't yet even predict. So to me, it feels a bit like a renaissance.
This is the museum of the world, about the world, and for the world. Here tonight to celebrate our new and really important partners, MIT and Microsoft. You will see here outcomes of our first collaborations.
AI is enabling us to actually play with the data itself, to generate new narratives. And then on the other hand, being creative has always pushed technology beyond its boundaries. I hope that people will start to see some of the promise that it holds to be a more inclusive and a diverse platform for people to jump in and play in.
As a museum experience starts becoming more than just a visit to a museum, but looking at the space of what we can do in a virtual world, the more people become aware actually what's in the Met is relevant to me. But ultimately, it's those ideas we want people to take away with them. It's for connections to culture, for connections to history.
So what I like about that, we didn't mention open access ones, but we do use the word open and relevance, which are key things. So I'm going to end there. Those are those 5 principles. I'm open to questions. I think Susanna's going to kick us off, but thank you.
Thank you. That was a very inspiring, lovely presentation indeed. I'm going to present to you 2 questions. One is related to the bigger picture. You started your presentation. You had lots of, fantastic one-liners. I could actually point several out from here. Actually, I do. Mm-hmm. Such as matching the people and the works. Mm-hmm. That's a great idea that there's an artwork or design object for every single person in the world. I think that's a wonderful idea. You said that we need to start thinking differently. We have to make decisions, for sure. I completely agree. And so on and so on. But now thinking about, after this presentation, the bigger picture, the future. Mm-hmm. If you think about all the collection resources in the world, globally, what the museums, archives, and libraries have, and how many projects are ongoing in terms of making the collection resources accessible. So what is your vision of the future, where this will be leading us?
The specific question being, where's the vision? So I guess the vision statement, I will go back to one artwork for every individual, but we will have removed every barrier for people to find that artwork. Right now, we say there's loads of projects, but objectively, museums themselves are working in relatively siloed ways. I don't see many really combined projects. Europeana is probably the only example I can think of as a success case, but I think even those working at Europeana are still struggling with how you be successful when you're working with so many institutions. It's a really challenging thing. At the Met, we actually consciously made the decision that we should just do it on our own, because to do it any other way would have slowed us down, and we don't think. And being the Met, I guess we leverage our brand to say, hey, we've got the most chance people are going to discover what the Met is, and will come to us. So I do think, in the future, how we manage our data as organizations, hopefully will become more unified. Hopefully we'll get much better softwares to manage that collections data, to then build on top of it. Right now, building an API is a struggle for organizations, and maintaining an API is a struggle for organizations. But these are fundamental building blocks. This stuff needs not to be a struggle. It just needs not to be a struggle, because whilst that's a struggle, I was going to say we're screwed. Like it's a real challenge, and so that how we manage our data is the biggest piece where I see for improvement. And I dare say, I think if we spent more time as institutions focusing on that problem rather than building like sexy front end things, I just say AR, VR, anything like that. Just say no. Seriously, we did it at the Met. To be really clear, I didn't even have a conversation about it. If that was in the email title, I would just say no. And apps is the same category, just to be really clear. I'd pop that there. Because I just say, if we're going to build, we've got to build as little as possible to fulfill our business goals, to represent ourselves online. And we've got to manage our data really impeccably, because that's what people are connecting to. And by building that layer really well, I know there are talks that Karen's brought in to really show what people are doing with that data. That's where I see the future being, where we can really start impacting on scale. So, focus on that vision. There's an artwork for every individual, which will inspire them. And then, removing those barriers, removing our brand from that question. It was a big, I remember sitting in rooms and saying, my aim is that someone finds this image and doesn't know it's from the Met. Seriously. Like, why should they care? Just let's take our ego out of this. Why should they care it's at the Met? They may not, the word museum may not even resonate with them. Let's be clear, this is a Western concept. Museums, you talked about museum history, as my background as well, I love that. But it's a Western concept, and I just think we need to be very conscious that museums aren't where everyone goes for inspiration. So if our aim is to connect people to knowledge, creativity, and ideas, we need to remove every single barrier we possibly can, including our ego, and just get the works out there. Just going through that conversation at the Met, it's not about our brand. It's not, we want to find someone to find the artwork before they even know it's part of the Met. If they're really interested, they'll discover it's from the Met, and we're very careful to put metadata in the images to point them back as best we can. But just that conversation was so healthy as an organization and created far more change, in my opinion, than any kind of feature improvement we ever did on the website or anything like that, just that conversation.
Yeah, and it's all related, of course, the issue about ownership.
Yeah,
and
totally.
Because we are still very, let's say, fixed with the ideas, as you say, with that, yes, the museums are physical places,
Yep.
houses like this, which are fantastic. But we need to be able to build on top of that as well, and then think about how we use those collection resources that are now out there in digital format. My other question for you is related to that, how we proceed from here in terms of skills and expertise. You said,
Yep.
and I love that part, when you started your presentation, you said that, yes, your mission is to make sure that everyone working with these issues have the word, digital.
Removed from their job title. Yep.
So, anyway, what's your view on the skills and expertise?
It's super challenging. Recruiting the type of talent that will make us successful in this space, learning those skill sets is an exercise. And so either the museum's got to significantly invest in their staff, in sending them to events like this, and more technical ones, because ultimately this gives us the skills to advocate for why we need to learn it. We then need to go and learn some of these technical skills and learn how to read an API. I'm an art historian. That's my background. I love 1920s, 1930s German art. George Grosz, Beckmann, Otto Dix, that's my world. I self-taught. I think we all have a responsibility, all of us, to learn how to read HTML, how to read CSS, how to read JavaScript. Just open the inspect element on Chrome and start having a look at how websites are built, because we have to learn that. I actually don't see another choice than that. It may be a bit annoying to have to learn a whole new language per se, but the people, our kids are learning it in school, and my kid's 22 months, so he's not there yet, but he's going to. And I just think we need to be rethinking about our skill sets and how we keep those up to date inside the organization. I think you need leadership of the organization to say straight up, I'm going to train everyone how to read HTML. I'm not asking you to build a website, but I want you to know how this stuff works, what an API looks like. It's actually really simple, super simple, but just start investing in that structure, and then be really realistic about how much you can build, how much you actually do. I do feel like museums, in my view, and I say the Met included in that, we would benefit from greater discipline, honestly, on what we do. There are so many ways to fulfill the Met mission. Whenever I was my less good self, I'd make a joke that that if I wanted to fulfill the Met mission, I would just buy a 3D printer, go and sit in the least visited gallery of a museum and print out one 3D object once a day and give it to someone who went to that gallery. I would still be fulfilling the mission. The return on investment would be pretty low. It would, but I'm fulfilling the mission. And I think if we took that as an extreme example, but I think if we really, again, took ourselves out of the equation of the things that we want to do for our museums and think, what do people actually use? And where is the return on investment? We'd become a lot more disciplined about how much we actually do, how much we actually build, and focus just on those highest impact areas. A quote I often told my team is the Steve Jobs quote, where he says that Apple wasn't successful because of what it did do, it's because of what it didn't do. Like, that's Apple, for God's sake. We should just take that as a basic premise now of everything that we work on. They were successful for what they didn't do, not for what they did.
Yeah, thank you. I just got good news, permission for one question from the audience. So now, be quick. Yeah? I'll give you the mic.
I think there might be a better question than this one. I'm actually interested in how you managed to, well, I know how you managed to do it because it's the Met and Google. But how do you think other museums might be able to get their API taken up by?
By, were you going to say a company in particular, or?
By Google.
Okay. First thing about how anyone's going to be able to partner, first of all, just start saying no to every company that contacts you. I'm deadly serious. I mean, that was a blanket. I mean, we need to lead the conversation based on our needs, okay? And these companies that are contacting you have a business need themselves, and we're poor museums, and even the Met, we're not resource plentiful. I mean, in my budget, so it stacks up to a lot of banknotes. But objectively, we were resource constrained as well. I mean, my first exercise as a department head was to reduce our budget by 18%. It was enormous. It was brutal. But these companies that are contacting us have their own needs, and I think we need to lead ourselves with that conversation. So first of all, give yourself some headspace by just saying, hey, first of all, I'm just going to say no to everyone contacting me. I'm going to start figuring out who do I actually, what are my business goals? What am I trying to achieve right now? And if you focus on that question alone and just publicize it, people start contacting you. I mean, Google in particular, they want this data. They are interested in working with us. We just need to set the parameters around how they can work with us. We just need to be
that's
informed.
a brilliant, let's say, piece of advice for all of us. And we, in your presentation, heard also a perfect roadmap. So I hope that you have made good notes on that. So thank you a lot for a very, as I said, inspiring presentation. Thank you.
So, it's with very great pleasure that I can introduce another, how can I say this? Because you're obviously not very old, but you're a very old OpenGLAMer, right? You've been working in Andrea Wallace has been working in this field of OpenGLAM for a long time. And I met her first at the last Sharing is Caring extension that was in Hamburg, where Andrea delivered the keynote about why should we do this. And ever since then, Andrea holds a PhD in law and is now at the University of Exeter. And we'll talk about finding the nuance in OpenGLAM for us today, because obviously not everything is just about getting it all out, but it's also about thinking why we're doing this and what are we doing, right? Welcome on stage, Andrea. You wanted this one?
Yeah, sure, does that work? Awesome. It's okay. I'm going to stay a bit stationary.
So yeah, thank you for inviting me, and also for the excellent introduction and the keynote presentation, which touched on various aspects of my presentation. I couldn't have asked for a kind of a better alley-oop. I'm thrilled to be here. It's my first time in Stockholm. So I'm Andrea Wallace. I know we just heard, excuse me, this is going to be an issue, an inspirational, really wonderful presentation. So now we have the lawyer to bring you down to talk about what you can't do. No, I'm just kidding, a little bit of that. But so yeah, the core of my research focuses on OpenGLAM, but that's both on-site and online. And how GLAMs enable public access to public domain collections, and how digital technologies in the law can either impede or aid that process. And of course, intellectual property is a key question, especially as we start to see that perceived line between material and digital disappear in collections management. But we're not past the basic issue of OpenGLAM, which is copyright being claimed in 2D reproductions of two-dimensional works. We're getting to that critical mass of institutions making those significant steps toward open, and the data that's around that and the shared experience that's helping other people open up, which of course is the theme of this presentation. And now that we have kind of greater data around what's going on, we're able to start to explore kind of the embedded or the secondary issues that are arising. So these, of course, can include issues around privacy and big data and the collection of data around our audiences, or accessibility to digital disabled audiences, and a number of other issues. So in light of the theme, I wanted to talk about one of these issues, which is becoming kind of a cornerstone of some of the research I've been doing recently. And it's not necessarily new, but it is gaining a bit of momentum due, to the digital aspects. And of course, that's the debate around the restitution of cultural heritage, and specifically how intellectual property concerns are crucial to repatriation policies. So governments across the EU right now, and of course elsewhere, are revisiting repatriation, and they're evaluating where national institutions should stand when returning colonial era objects that were collected from formerly colonized countries. And at the moment, this discussion is heavily focused on Africa, so that's where I'm going to be basing my discussion today, while I'll have some other examples from other communities. And while it might seem like IP is totally tangential to this discussion, I'm the lawyer that's going to convince you that it should be everything that you're thinking of. Okay, I know that's what we lawyers do. But it is really important to consider IP alongside any of the changes in law that are required to enable restitution. And I just want to mention quickly that this is based on ongoing research that I have with a colleague at Exeter, Mathilde Pavis. If she's watching, hi. So I'll be discussing that later in the presentation as well. So on that note, let's kind of situate ourselves on where we sit in this debate. So maybe you saw this image. It was widely circulated across Twitter. It was great. It's a painting by John Trumbull that depicts the signing of the Declaration of Independence by the American forefathers, which are all settler, colonizer landowners, and which is now displayed in the US Capitol, which is on native land. So those red dots signal people who were enslavers and who financially and personally benefited from the exploitation of enslaved peoples. And this treatment of the work both obstructs our perception, and it also exposes the underlying history of this constructed moment. And it calls on us to critically examine the legal and social systems that we have inherited, who they benefit, and to challenge their broad application as the world becomes increasingly globalized. Which brings me to copyright and its crucial dynamic in this area. So the legal systems that determine whether and under what circumstances copyright will arise in both material and digital culture are products of colonial histories, and that's starting with the 1710 Statute of Anne, leading to modern copyright law, all of which this is a UK reference. And including systems that regulate the underlying objects, so systems that sustain the ownership and control over the work's digital file. So these laws, especially in the UK, are often held up as barriers to restitution, right? The trustees can't do anything, they can't deaccession these works because the law does not permit it. But these types of excuses that the law doesn't permit restitution are false claims to innocence, and the laws themselves are inherited and can be changed. So if all this sounds a bit abstract, let's do a little bit of framing. So OpenGLAM, of course, has championed the release of public domain data for public reuse. Instances like these are not open because they don't permit commercial reuse. But if you'll notice, the example that I selected is actually William Hogarth. So this is one of the series from A Rake's Progress. So in the UK, Hogarth played a critical role in lobbying for the 1735 Engravings Acts, which extended the scope of copyright to cover engravings. And in its time, it only covered engravings that were both designed and engraved by the artist, and only for 14 years after publication. So this series passed into the public domain 270 years ago, but the public's ability to access and use this copy is restricted by the museum's copyright claim. And while we might enjoy like a sense of irony in the museum's perpetual copyright of Hogarth's reproductions, the very country where copyright was first formalized into national law, and which he helped to do, this changes when we start to consider it against heritage of communities that have suffered from the effects of empire and colonization. And in fact, there's various digital versions of the Ho'ohakananaya online, all of which are marked copyright trustees of the British Museum. And the museum's rhetoric and narrative around Ho'ohakananaya seems unfit for a moai which is described by the descendants as Rapa Nui's soul. So the moai is one of the many works held by the museum that recently, or even across decades, have been requested by descendant communities who've been dispossessed of their culture during colonization. But both online and on-site exhibitions fail to acknowledge this, and instead they present the moai as a gift from Queen Victoria. So we have a combination of legal measures that are being used to justify the possession and the exploitation of Ho'ohakananaya, from the bequest notice in the gallery to the copyright notices online. Obviously, this is beginning to change. It's not clear how long the status quo will continue, and this is obviously just one example. So there have been these conversations among institutions for years now, but it's really been kind of sped up by this, I don't know if you know these two scholars. I'm hoping you'll recognize them because we're about to talk about it. So November 2017, French President Emmanuel Macron commissioned a report on the restitution of African cultural heritage. And in November of last year, these two scholars, Felwine Sarr and Bénédicte Savoy, published a 252-page report. It's in English and in French, and it's on France's role in this area. It makes recommendations for how restitution should go forward, and how this whole discussion, as a result, has kind of sped up how governments and institutions are starting to re-examine their own practices. So it's been kind of a catalyst in this area. So I'm going to use the report as a talking point for finding the nuance in this specific context, especially because the report does make recommendations around digital and open access. And of course, the primary purpose of the report in all of its entirety is to discuss the material culture, the history, the responsibility of France in relation to exploited African cultures, and all of the challenges that will underlie restitution, its administrative processes, and potential reparations. But there's a very short section about the sharing of digital content. It's on pages 67 to 68 of the English version. And they're really helpful for kind of teasing out the nuance and some of the discussions from the earlier presentations about how we start to kind of hone in on open access and what that means. So here it says, for works already digitized and held by French institutions, the report recommends a radical practice of sharing, including how one rethinks the politics of image rights use. And it promotes the creation of a single open access portal to documentation of African cultural heritage and associated materials held in collections. And for works not yet digitized, the report recommends systematic digitization following a dialogue between the institution and all the parties involved. So I want to use this to kind of discuss where we might start to think about the nuance, and especially shifting who has a say in this process. So if you're interested, Matilda and I have written a response, and it goes into much more detail about the concerns that are raised in this paragraph of the report. We circulated it, and it was signed by 108 scholars and practitioners who are working in law and cultural heritage, and some of them are in the room today. It's available CC BY on Zenodo, so it can be translated. But let's consider these recommendations in context, beginning with a radical practice of sharing and how one rethinks the politics of image rights use. So as a recommendation, we should all want this, especially considering the state of copyright around the most reproduced image in the world, which in situ is in the Louvre in France. And in fact, this is a data visualization that I made of an online search that I did as part of a chapter for a book of copyright-free Mona Lisas of the various reproductions through various forms of technology across history held by institutional websites and commercial licensing agencies. And it captures all the various layers of reproduction that might also be in an image. So we might start with a material object that then was made into a sketch, that then was turned into a print, that then was photographed, and so on. And in this assessment and copyright clearance, only 9 were actually made available as public domain. So even tracing the provenance of the main image that's on Wikipedia reveals that there's a copyright claim on the source website. And when you look at the user who uploaded, it's Derek Coetzee. So I don't know if that rings a bell to some of you, but he's who received a cease and desist from the National Portrait Gallery for doing this exact thing, uploading images online that had copyright claims. But the underlying issue here is that if that recommendation is adopted by the French government, it'll set a double standard of imposing open access and free access to digital cultural heritage collections of African cultural heritage, while there are no obligations for the French institutions to do the same. So this Google Sheet is an OpenGLAM survey that is primarily managed by Doug, but which I had a hand in getting together. And it collects instances of OpenGLAM globally. So you can scroll down and you can see that there's, I guess I should preface this by saying there's really no kind of standard definition for open access, but we've been pushing the one that at least allows commercial use, okay, so we can all get on board with that. But here you can see that there's only 15 institutions in France that make eligible data available for commercial use, and only 9 have adopted open access policies that apply to all their eligible data. But you still have to click around and dig a bit deeper in each of those institutions' collection to get a more accurate picture of what that actually means. So this radical practice of sharing is not yet imposed on French institutions. And we should also look closer, again, at the politics of image rights use. So one of the museums in the report that receives a lot of focus is the Musée du Quai Branly in Paris, which holds about 70,000 sub-Saharan African treasures, and that represents about 2/3 of the African objects that are held in France. So according to the museum's digital collection and the exhibition portal, it hosts 1,063,313 objects of African digital cultural heritage, or in other words, these are images of African material cultural heritage, including the objects themselves, archival and exhibition materials, audio, video, and associated data and metadata around all of these works and their digital surrogates. And the museum claims copyright in all of it. So the politics that are embedded in this copyright secure to the institution the right to benefit economically from the object's possession, its exploitation, its reproduction, and the claim to intellectual property also carries the ability to exclude others from accessing the collection and its embodied knowledge. And it ends up fortifying the effects of colonization by rewarding the rights holder with control over access and reuse of all of this content. But the report doesn't advocate, by emptying museums, which has been kind of a criticism that has been thrown at the report. If we send everything back, there'll be nothing left. It actually just starts by identifying a group of works fit for restitution, like this Benin bronze. And it highlights the very many ways that African material culture has been exposed to a system of appropriation and alienation. But we also have to take all of this discussion and apply it to the digital heritage as well, because that appropriation and alienation extends to control over how the work has been documented and cataloged, how it has historically been exhibited, as well as contemporary forms of exhibition, how it's been merchandised through postcards, who has economically benefited from that, how it has been redocumented through various technologies over the years, as well as written about, and the authority, knowledge generation, and dissemination of knowledge around the works, including the descendant communities. So when we think about digital appropriation in this context, we really want to confront the authorship role that copyright plays, because it carries the ability to symbolically appropriate all of the digital content around those works for the rights holder. And if the material object is returned while the digital objects stay with the museum, then is that really something that we're thinking about in terms of restitution and making reparations for the communities who have not had a chance, to reappropriate and assimilate with their own heritage? And then we also have to consider moral rights, so both with regards to the material object itself and the digital reproduction, because institutions in France will have to get consent in order to digitize the works, but there'll be a second layer of moral rights that'll apply as soon as the work is digitized. And of course, a precondition of the work is that in order to have moral rights, the copyright has to arise. So here we have a 3D work that's been digitized, and so we'll have a copyright here. Which means the RMN Grand Palais, the Musée Quai Branly, and the photographer Patrick Riez could exercise moral rights over this photograph. And France defines moral rights as perpetual. They exist forever. They're inalienable. You can't separate them from the author. So while the copyright in this image might expire, the moral rights will live on forever. And there's also a number of African countries, notably many that were previously colonized or occupied by France, that have similar moral rights perpetual regimes. So if followed, all this discussion about systematic digitization means that all the material culture will be digitized in France to begin with. So all of that law will apply because it occurs in France. But we should potentially question, who's best placed to undertake this task and what systems of values will inform that answer. So there's a paper by Andrew Prescott and Lorna Hughes that argues for slow digitization processes. And they say that, paying the same attention that we pay to the processes of digitization should also, be mirrored by the objects themselves. So instead of rapidly digitizing everything, let's critically examine why we're digitizing the things that we're digitizing and how we're doing it. And digitization, this is like one of those words that digitization is a cultural and curatorial prerogative, right? So presentation, access control, all of that should really belong to the community that's responsible for the work. Because it will impact how heritage is represented, preserved, remembered, and legally, the reality remains that that basic foundation for possession of the work doesn't hold up. It's been taken, it's been looted, so all of the subsequent acts around that specific object fall into question. And there's also been a lot of concern that restitution, might be conditioned upon the digitization of the work. So we have to digitize it before we're going to send it back to you, because there's that need to preserve and that expectation that we're going to lose something if we return it and the work disappears. But Hamidi Bokoum, who's the director of the Museum of Black Civilizations, has said, the restitution of Africa's stolen assets shouldn't be dependent on us having space to display it. Those who stole our assets cannot dictate what we do with them. For example, if a community wants to restore their assets to sacred forests from which they were taken, that is their right. So we should probably accept that some of the works are going to be lost, and this need to preserve the work is also rooted in Western practices around collections management and preservation. There's a number of organizations, though, that are exploring these issues. So if we have in digitization, which I don't know if you're following the OpenGLAM account, they dominated it this summer. It was amazing. But they're looking at questions around indigenization of collections management and data sovereignty, as well as local contexts, which has developed labels to help Indigenous, Native, First Nations, Aboriginal communities manage some of the digital rights or the content in the digital environment that they're creating within their communities. And then Whose Knowledge, which challenges dominant narratives around culture and tries to recenter that of the marginalized communities on the internet. So restitution itself is always going to be, a big and complicated endeavor to begin with, which is why when LOIC kept saying, stop it with the sexy ideas about the huge, grand, this thing that we're going to build, I was like, yes. Because we always want to go big and create new portals, and that was another recommendation in the report. Let's make a single open access portal to all documentation. But maybe we could use some of the stuff that's already out there. So one of the reasons why, citizen-led initiatives like Wiki, GitHub, et cetera, are great platforms, even though, they have their own issues of authority and gatekeeping, is because it allows other people to kind of start to engage in the narrative and developing the knowledge around some of the works that we hold. But we also, of course, need institutions to play a role in educating the public about what type of treatment is appropriate for certain works. So when we think about intellectual property in that context, and we start to think about open access and what that means, something that's also really interesting, I don't know if you've been seeing, there's been a lot written about the Benin bronzes specifically in the restitution, but these two works that are licensed public domain are appearing in every single one of these newspaper articles, and especially the one that's on the very left, which is CC by SA, which is clearly taken in a museum, which means that the photography, visitor photography rules were violated. But yeah, so we're seeing the same three images that are kind of dominating this discussion as well. But there's a risk of digitally imposing our Western perspectives of how IP should be exploited or not, how access should or should not be extended to the materials. And this is actually an opportunity for us to start thinking about whether certain materials should just kind of be set aside from intellectual and even digitization frameworks entirely. But then on the other hand, if there is copyright, we should be thinking about who benefits economically from the dissemination of the work. And if the community wants copyright and wants to do that, we should also allow that as well. So this rethinking might also apply to objects that are not designated for restitution. And the Auckland Museum has developed really comprehensive cultural permissions policies, working in tandem with the communities of the objects that they hold, that now controls not only the digital engagement, but also their on-site engagement with the works. So the report refers to this opportunity to invert the colonial hegemonic relationship, but there's also an opportunity to kind of do that here with the treatment of cultural heritage in our own institutions. So one thing that we're revisiting is how to kind of build this idea and all of these ideas into the OpenGLAM principles through the revision that's kind of ongoing. And Douglas is going to be speaking more about this tomorrow. And at the moment, though, we start to see that all of this is becoming a little bit more normalized, and we're not really questioning some of the nuance in how these works are being displayed and how the discussions are kind of occurring around them, because things are moving so fast, and they're almost becoming transparent. So one of the things, and these are my final thoughts, is just, when we start to think about transferring that control to the communities of origin, what are we missing that might actually be undertaken by the community? What other types of engagement, what other perspectives in digitization, might be presented to the public by letting go of the control over how this proceeds? Because there are different interpretations and conceptions of cultural heritage, and especially when it makes the transfer from material to digital, we have to make sure that digital is not treated as an afterthought in future ongoing restitution policies. And so rather than this radical practice of sharing, we're encouraging kind of this, let's co-develop situations where people are able to co-inform each other, right? So our policies change just as much as restitution occurs, and all of this kind of goes forward. And that's it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for this talk. It triggers a lot of thought, because just as you said, it seemed so easy. Let's just all make it, let's just all digitize it and make it available, and then you come and bring in the afterthought, but what happens and so on. And you also pointed out that how some museums or institutions make use of the law and sort of hide behind the law. It's like, yeah, we would like to do something else, but the law doesn't allow it. But sometimes it's also, then you pointed out how copyright is sort of not fit for our for our reality nowadays anymore, right? But it's hard to change the laws. I mean, they can be changed, but it takes a lot of time. So what would you say, what would be something to start with, not to walk into those mistakes that you pointed out?
I ascribe to the fail-forward approach, in terms of learning, trying to figure out how to approach these things, new iterations and readapting. But I also don't necessarily think that some of us in this room have that answer, and those answers should come from the communities whose objects we hold. And so whether or not the government needs to start building in systems that allow us to have that money to pay people for their labor, that historically has been kind of just taken, like, give us your knowledge, give us this, like, that would be nice to be able to fund those types of initiatives. But I think just making space for those discussions to occur is what's most important.
So the answer would, in parts, also be co-creation?
Co-creation or release of control, right? And I know that feels a bit like kind of crazy and unknown, but like we don't always have the best answers.
Yeah, I think we can all subscribe to that. Is there any question from the audience? Yes?
Can you say something about your thoughts on the new copyright directive in the European Union and the paragraph that will ensure within the next 2 years that all objects that are digitized that belong to the public domain should also go into the public domain in the light of your talk?
So I'm probably a bit pessimistic than most people about the outcome of this article. It's Article 14 of the new Copyright and the Digital Single Market Directive. And it says any material that's produced during acts of reproduction should remain in the public domain once they were made digital. And so the argument has always been that there is copyright, right? And I think that there's going to be a lot of institutions who continue to say, but no, we do have copyright in this because we've made that creative contribution. But I do think it'll be a catalyst in getting other institutions to take that step forward and open up and do that sort of thing. Also, from like a really nerdy legal perspective, all of the case law that we have, which is few and far between about reproduction, is based off of analog photography. So it's very easy to make an argument to say, oh, but no, we had to do this in digital and it required this and everything's different, so of course it was a creative contribution. So I'm a bit skeptical as to whether it's gonna have the impact, maybe in the long run, but we'll have to see. Something else, though, that is really relevant to that is the PSI directive, which of course is about making public sector information available. And there's an article about exclusive arrangements. You can form an exclusive arrangement for the purpose of digitization, and then you are supposed to have all the copies of the material, and after 10 years, the public will get it, and you have to make it available free of charge. Think back to what digital stuff you were using 10 years ago in 2009, and whether you think that that's appropriate for most of the purposes that we need today. Also think about how fast things have happened since 2009 to 2019 and what the future is even going to be in 2029, right? So I don't know. I think open access is actually the way forward, but trying to figure out the nuance in all of this and how to best accomplish that, both with respect to actual creative works and the authors and the rights that arise and the communities of origin around some of the material objects that we hold, is like the next kind of field of questions that we have to start to navigate. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have any more questions? Any questions coming in through the web? Yes. Okay. Yeah, you maybe should sit here.
You can actually read it yourself.
Okay, it says, thanks, Andrea. Thanks, Web. If someone uses the Internet Archive, takes a snapshot of a museum's webpage, oh, so me, with copyright images of a collection on it, where does the copyright then lie? Or would this count as fair use for research purposes? So yes. Yes. I think, so the first question is, where does copyright lie? It's arguable that a snapshot, there's no copyright in a snapshot, right? So in that sense, there's no copyright in that digital file. But would this count as fair use for research purposes is the second question, because obviously there's a copyright in the website. I say yes. I clearly use a lot of visual stuff in my work. But that will depend on the jurisdiction and on fair use and whether that applies and la 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 la. So thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much. There's another question coming up here from the audience. And I think that needs to be the last question because we need to get on.
I just want to follow up on your point back to Maretta on Article 14. And how does that work in terms of Spain, France, Italy actually having put laws in that there is copyright in the digitization of the object?
So that'll, I guess that will reveal itself during national implementation. We'll have to see how Article 14 is transcribed, whether it's verbatim, whether other modifications to the Copyright Acts will have to occur. One thing that is interesting is that now all of those countries that have the other photographs protection won't be able to use other photograph protection for the work. So I think in terms of, and there's like, I think a dozen, maybe just under. So yeah, we'll see. Bye.
I'm gonna take your mic. Thank you very much, Andrea, for that. Okay, and I present to you the next speaker, BODIL AXELSSON from Linköping University. And BODIL, you've had a title in the program that I've got the most comments about. It was called A Question of and like, I got so many emails because everybody's like, you have a typo in your, so now you changed it. I was so looking forward to asking you, what does that actually mean? Do you feel like you want to explain it, or maybe afterwards?
I actually could explain it. The title was originally a title of an article for a scientific or for a journal, and it draws back to an idea about that capitalism is schizophrenic and allows a lot of parallel things. But I got so many from the reviewers, so harsh critique, so I just cut that out from the article. And now we have this instead. Okay. So that's the story behind.
I see. I was a bit I thought like, oh my God, I clicked on the wrong presentation but then you chose. Okay, you're researching heritagization, the process in which cultural institutions, associations, and individuals produce meaningful pasts. That is a bit like connected to what Andrea just talked about, but you might have some other thoughts for us as well. So I'll just leave it to you and come back after your talk. Thank you.
So, I have lent this new title of my presentation from the artist Fred Wilson's exhibition, Mine in the Museum, in the Maryland Historical Society. And the aim of the exhibition was to present the museum's collections in a critical light. The Maryland Historical Society was founded to collect, preserve, and study objects related to the state's history. This mission included accounts of colonization, slavery, and abolition. But the museum tended to present this history from the viewpoint of its white male funding board. So, in the installation Metalwork, Wilson reshuffled the museum's collection to highlight the history of African Americans. The installation juxtaposed ornate silver pitchers, flacons, and teacups with a pair of iron slave shackles. Traditionally, the display of arts and craft was kept separate from the display of traumatic artifacts such as the slave shackles. By displaying these artifacts side by side, Wilson made apparent the link between the two kinds of metalworks. The production of the one was made possible by the enforcement of the other. So I have chosen to start this presentation with the example of Fred Wilson for two reasons. First, it shows the importance of context for meaning making. The meaning of an object or a work of art is decided not only through its form, shape, and biography, but also through its interplay with other objects or elements. Secondly, the installation highlights the material and economic underpinnings of culture. So in this talk, I invite you to consider sharing through the lens of political media economy, a research perspective that highlights the economics underpinnings of search engines and online platforms. And I realize that I can be a party pooper, party spoiler here. But I will be really clear. I will raise some critical questions and concerns regarding our reliance on Google's search engines and social media platform. But I am by no means against digitizations of museums' objects and work of art. I am not against open collection management systems or the use of social media platforms. I do not consider it as an option to turn back to closed systems. I fully embrace sharing. However, the ways in which the platforms we all use rely on data mining present museums with opportunities as well as cultural and social dilemmas. So I've been drawing on a critical American scholar named Philip Kalantz's Cope, and he suggests that the internet economy thrives on two main principles: a participatory normativity and a grammar of digital exceptionalism that legitimize a particular intellectual property agenda. And I'm citing Kalantz's Cope here. In a manner peculiar to this age and this moment of capitalism development, we hear that the act of giving away one's intellectual property is preeminently an act of freedom, the individual's gift for a common good. A system of obligation is engendered in the exceptional gift thesis, one of personal responsibility to give as well as to take in the intellectual commons. In this way, the value of participation is primarily positioned in a normative domain. Peer production is associated with free labor and the autonomy of action with non-rivalrous property. And this is a motivation to enmesh more and more of our time in social media. In line with scholars of political economy, Philip Kalantz's Cope unveils how individual creativity and participation are commodified when global companies capture digital labor, turn it into data, and offer the data to the market. It presupposes a condition of digital exceptionalism, where we have non-rivalrous property. One's use does not exclude another's. And he contrasts that to an older or coexistent way of organizing property, rivalrous property. One's use exclude another's. And I will return to how these two, rivalrous and non-rivalrous property, kind of interact today. And Kalantz's Cope argues that the digital economy postulates that a gift for the common good is simultaneously a gift to the internet economy. This suggestion propelled me to think through what sharing means for museums in the information economy. What are museums giving, and what do they get in return? What are the trade-offs? What are the pros and cons for museums when they rely on infrastructures that are governed and owned by media businesses? Obviously, they offer convenience, and also listen to you talk, LOIC. They also offer reach. You can actually reach a lot of people. They provide museums with spaces where people socialize, keep contact with friends and relatives, and discuss in interest groups. Facebook have proved great for posting events, Twitter for professional discussions, and Flickr and Pinterest allow for the circulation of images. Wikimedia Commons and Wikipedia are non-profit organizations, but they are highly dependent on Google search engines to work. So social media, they offer convenience. They also offer visibility for museums. They draw attention to the institutions, and they help them to build up their brand and reputation. And this image here is from Livrustkammaren, the Royal Armoury's highly successful Facebook feed that has a lot of followers and a lot of content. And what is happening here, according to Adam Arvidsson and Eleanor Coglioni, if I look at this from this researcher's perspective, it is that you have webs of affective attention around informational objects. So when digitization multiplies in online space, the reputation of the institution multiplies and disseminates too. In my research, I have taken special interest in Pinterest. And content sharing platforms such as Flickr and Pinterest offer museums and audiences new spaces for curation. In the terms of Barbara Kirschenblatt-Gimblet, they are spaces for agency of display, involving the enaction of choice, framing and contextualizing and anticipating reception. Like social media and search engines generally, the technologies running these platforms curate too. They select content and preempt what the user wants. As stated by Anne Catherine Hales, American literary scholar, computational media are not just another technology, they are the quintessentially cognitive technology. They are driven by algorithm and machine learning computations. In the case of social media and search engines, they act on the information and the traces we deliberately and not so deliberately leave behind to predict what we want next. And Catherine Hales, she means that both humans and technical cognitive systems, such as search engines, are cognizers in the sense that they are able to exercise choice. Although human and machine cognizer operate under very different material and physical circumstances, Hales suggests that they enact similar functions. They can both enact choices within given context. And the key word here is context. So I will use Pinterest as to provide a glimpse of how this works. Digitizations from all kinds of museum and all sizes of museum now appear on Pinterest. Museums themselves use the platform, and also everyone that is computer savvy can collect images from museum collections or own images from all places to create so-called boards and become a pinner. And in the beginning of 2019, the platform had 175 billion images and shared by 250 million users. And that is a lot of data to keep track of. So upon entering Pinterest, as a regular user of the platform, one is presented with a grid of images. So this is my grid of images, and it reflects my research on Viking jewelry, but it also reflects that I'm doing some other things in life. So it heavily relies on personalization. The content of the grid depends on my previous actions on the platform, what I have collected on my own boards, which boards I follow, my previous trajectories on the platform. But it also depends on how I construct myself as a data subject, how I set my account in terms of what I allow the platform to know about gender, location, language, and activities on other platforms. So recommendation services like Pinterest, they are built by humans in a market context, but run by software and code. Human cognizers supply the platform with information, which in turn is acted upon by machine learning algorithms programmed by the platform's engineers. What appears on the screen depends on complex computational processes that to a large extent is black boxed. But Pinterest engineers, they promote their company by describing how their algorithms work. So I've been reading a lot about trying to understand how they work, these algorithms. So what you see when you click on an images, you automatically get a new grid of very, very similar images. And this is possible thanks to machine learning algorithms. And in general, these kind of algorithms solve a set of problems by selecting mathematical functions and statistical models. In case of supervised learning, and that is what Pinterest use, engineers apply the function on a certain data set. They evaluate and optimize the algorithms and before applying them to much larger data sets from which they may infer new outputs. It is a form of experimental science, which classification, ranking, and predictions are optimized. Once training is completed, machine learning algorithms inductively generate similarity from the attributes of the data they are exposed to. So Pinterest machine learning algorithms produce patterns in the data and make recommendations out of these patterns. Their algorithms are trained by engineers to recognize categories in annotations, how we describe our pins. They can read images, and they can read boards, and they can also compile all these kinds of data. For example, Pinterest employ visual recognition machine learners to identify shapes, forms, and colors, as well as human-made categories, as for example, pearls. The algorithms are capable of detecting, classifying, and selecting images in their entirety, as well as in details. So that's why you get these small single pearls here. And essential for these learning and selecting processes are how users collect things in board. Boards help them to kind of see what to choose. And the description of images are also important here. When making predictions for relevant content, the platform has a broad variety of information to take into account. All the information here and all the information of us users, and also information of boards and how boards are similar to each other. And Pinterest can also retrieve information on my home feed, my searches, and my interaction with pins and collections. So Pinterest recommendation service thus relies on data mining and computation. The platform does not display conventional ads. Instead, ads are camouflaged as promoted pins. I don't think there is a promoted pin here, but sometimes there are pearls for sale on Etsy, or you can find pearls from big auction houses, and they are mixed. Pinterest doesn't discriminate between different sources. You can get images that look the same from a lot of different sources. And the platform sells data to a very, very limited number of data analytics companies. They are not as far as aggressive of selling data as Facebook and Google, but they do it low key, and therefore they're just not valued that high on the stock market. In fact, they are just recently introduced. And also, Pinterest is a very friendly place, to my knowledge. It's supporting aesthetic values and very seldom and rarely politics, and that's also part of the platform's framing of themselves. From a political economist perspective, platforms such as Pinterest bring together public, private, and civil sectors in society to assimilate public and economic values. This predicament brings me back to Kalantz's Cope argument that the digital economy postulates that a gift for the common good is simultaneously a gift to the internet economy. I have previously discussed what museums gain in exchange. It is now time to turn to questions concerning what museums invest or what they might lose. First, museums invest time and resources into the digitization of objects and the management of data. And this investment includes what Andrea talked about, time-consuming procedures of rights clearances and copyright, licensing procedures, and the marking up of works for the public domain. The CC0 license and the public domain mark are also developed by the Creative Commons, are used to encourage reuse. To put it differently, they are applied to promote and ensure the non-rivalrous nature of museum digitization. A perhaps minor investment concerns the working hours institutions allocate to interaction on Facebook, etc. From a political economy perspective, digitization programs and rights clearances could be discussed in terms of content production, and the time spent on platforms may be framed as digital labor. The ways in which platforms make money on content production and digital labor have been one of the most debated and not yet settled question in a political economist's take on the internet economy. There is a division between those who accentuate the value generation for first and foremost has to do with how much time we spend on these platforms. But a more complicated version of the story is that there are kind of entanglements of time spent on the platforms, placement of ads, the mining and commodification of data, and also value generation in the stock market. And one of the researchers in this area, Mark Andrejevic, argues that the platforms take very little interest in the content that users post. They are first and foremost interested in generating value from all the data that we produce when interacting on the platforms. Metadata, or the massive amount of data about behaviors, preferences, activities, and location that social media are programmed to manage and capture, that is the most important asset for media companies. User data is then turned into rivalrous property that can be bought and sold, and is the asset that contributes to the company's value on the stock market. So while content is non-rivalrous, the data that is produced out of content is rivalrous. And ANDREA, he also points out that the mining of data significantly adds to the political implications of the internet economy. The scale of data mining, the sheer size of the mined data, and the fact that without access to instruments and technologies for extracting knowledge from the data on an aggregated level, users are estranged not only from value generation, but also from the social knowledge they collectively produce. In exchange for access to communication infrastructures, all kinds of users submit not only to monetization of their labor, but also to surveillance and unforeseen consequences of data analysis. So if museums would like to know things about their audiences, what they do on the internet, they have to either buy the data from data analytic companies or hire analytics that can work with APIs to capture the data and then do the analysis. After Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, very few of us, I guess, are unaware of risks such as media manipulation, attention hacking, and micro-targeting that comes with data mining. I have not done research in this area myself, so I share a section here from a recent EU report. The authors state that even though the GDPR seeks to mitigate some of the risk and infringements of users' privacy, it is still possible and common practice among marketers, advertisers, publishers, and political campaigners alike to leverage user data to gain insight about users' behavior, preferences, attitudes, and lifestyles. Big data that supercharges digital advertising, content marketing, and political campaigning by appealing to an audience in a more direct and intricate ways. So if memory institutions would like to look for broader patterns in the data to get to know more about their audiences and the use of their holdings, they need to tread carefully in order not to violate the audience's integrity. And also in times when heritage is increasingly politicized, not the least in Scandinavia, there are also risks of the mapping and molding of opinions in order to get support for political agendas. Social scientists, some social scientists I would say, fear that such interferences facilitate current tendencies of polarizations in society. Because the services of data analytic companies and the affordances of APIs are also open to stakeholders that not have without democratic agendas or be populist agendas. Data for sale may have implications for opinion making, privacy, and free speech in relation to heritage. And I have no kind of way out of this. This is what we're in, all of us, right now. But what we as human cognizers can bring to this context or this equation are ethics and care and the ability to create and sustain relationship with audiences and, in a sense, be out there, I would say. And I will end with a citation from Marcel Mauss, who is one of the main theorists around gifts. He reminds us that the exchange of goods is also a moral transaction that involves bringing about and pursuing relationships between persons and groups.
Thank you, Bodil.
There were a lot of thoughts, very dense. I think we all need to process this a bit, but if I got you right, what you were saying is also that the more the museums put out there, the more the risk is that people get more and more entangled in the digital economy. Is that correct?
Sort of.
Sort of?
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Okay, we'll just assume I'm correct, right?
Yeah. I think nothing wrong with your interpretation, more than kind of, okay.
No, but I was trying to sort of break down what I thought I understood. And the funny thing is that we're all aware of those risks of surveillance and being cautious about our personal data and so on. And especially when it comes to OpenGLAM, we always have said, or the institutions that believe in this concept have said, like, yeah, this is why we have to get our data out there, because we cannot leave the digital sphere to the big actors. This is why museums, that's what LOIC said, this is why museums have to learn new skills, because we have to handle this reality, and we cannot leave the internet to the people that scream the loudest. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that, because I don't think that currently there are no options. They're very free digital spaces. They are in developments, but we don't have them right now. So this is what we have, and this is what we need to work with. We all need to work with this. And I don't have a clear idea on how to do that. But I guess that it's has to be part of digitization at museums as well.
Well, I think what you put up there is what is part of digitization. We all do this in order to connect with our audiences, or we should at least. So then there's not really a problem, because you have this idea that you do this because you want a relationship with the audience, right? Do we have any questions from the audience? Any more comments from the audience? You're all waiting for the coffee, right? As always. Right, so Bodil will also be here during the coffee break, of course, and you'll be with us for the rest of the day. Yes, so if you come to any more questions during the coffee break, just feel free to catch her or any of the other speakers. And we'll be back here at 3:30 and hear some more about actual use of open data. I'm really much looking forward to that. Okay, see you 3:30 back here. And no coffee in here. Thank you.